Okay, so, hello everyone. My name is Argenrost. I play Waldstein. I've been playing him for a very, very long time. Some months ago, I put together a live stream tutorial, like I'm doing right now, that went pretty in-depth with the character. I failed to actually save that because I'm a genius. But that's okay, because even as I was making it, I realized that things were kind of out of order, and there were a lot of new things that I had kind of discovered over time that I wasn't really able to contribute. So even though this is still kind of stream of consciousness, I wanted to redo this, one, so I could actually properly archive it and have it out in the wild, and two, to incorporate things that I wasn't really able to go over before. So if you remember the previous video, hopefully you learned something new. If you haven't seen this yet, hopefully you learned more about how this character works. So yeah, I'm gonna be going pretty in depth about like just about everything that I can. And yeah, so I'm kind of just going to go straight through. If there are like questions or anything, I'll try to put those off until I'm done. And we'll do it in that order. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So, in case you didn't already know, Wald is like the quintessential grappler, big body character of Under Night. He takes up a very, very large portion of the screen, although most of that is just his arms, and his arms don't actually have hurt boxes attached to them. Regardless, he takes up a lot of space. His playstyle, I mean, he's a grappler, so the playstyle of a grappler is usually pretty much implied. You want to get in, you want to throw people. What makes Wald unique as a grappler, however, is that he kind of embodies an element of grapplers that people talk about frequently in fighting games but don't easily see, where the way that you normally want to play a grappler in high level and fighting games is you want to use the rest of the tools that you have at your disposal to scare people into being defensive and wanting to block, so that when they're finally too scared to hit buttons, you can grab them. Wald emphasizes this heavily by the fact that he has a lot of moves that have a ton of range, lots of ways to enforce plus frames, more so than most characters in the game, if not all. And really just a lot of ways to make it so that it's easy to hit buttons in bad spots against Wald until you finally just get too scared to hit anything and then you get snatched. Being the big body character of this game, he has the highest vitality total of any character. If I remember correctly, his health total is 11,400, which I think is 400 or 500 more than the next highest character in the game. It's about 2,000 more than Seth, and it's about 1,000-ish more than the average health total of characters in the game. I've been playing the character so long that I barely noticed the health difference, but a lot of people will swear that it's pretty noticeable. He can definitely take like a few more hits from certain characters that can be very crucial for coming back. So he does have a pretty good health advantage. One key thing you will note about Wald, however, is that his typical movement is very slow. His walk speed is atrocious. His dash speed is also atrocious. Unlike most anime grapplers, his backdash is not really that great. He does technically have one of the highest amounts of invulnerability frames on his dash of any character in the game, but the recovery doesn't really make it worth it because his backdash recovery is in like the mid to high 30s, whereas characters with really good backdashes like Hyde and Gordo have like 22 frame backdashes, so it's not really all that great. So yeah, Wald's grounded movement not very good. But what keeps Wald in the game is the fact that the universal assault mechanic is a godsend, because it pretty much moves at the same speed as every other character's assault, and he has really, really big buttons that he can use to take advantage of it. So as you can see, I can assault and hit my jump C, and I can hit people from like almost full screen away. It's very, very good. So assault really is Wald's saving grace in terms of a universal mechanic in the game, because it actually gives him mobility that he wouldn't otherwise have. So, those are kind of some general things to note about Wald. The weaknesses of this character, because we've covered the strengths at this point. The primary weakness that Wald has is being a grappler, and also being very large. Even though he can take up a lot of space, he doesn't have much in the way of speed. His fastest normals clock in at 8 frame startup. To clarify, a typical fast normal in Under Night is 5 frames, so that's a pretty significant difference in the speed. And there are a lot of sensitive situations where that speed differential makes a huge, huge difference. What it ultimately means, without digging too deep into it, is that Wald has a very hard time getting out of pressure that doesn't involve the usage of an invincible reversal or like a really risky maneuver. So defensively, it's probably not fair to say that Wald is a weak character, but without resources, he definitely struggles on defense against the vast majority of the cast. Also, even though he does have good reversals at his disposal, both of them are pretty slow by most reversal standards. And generally, they're very easy to either safe jump or react to and then punish. So really, defense is where Wald kind of falls apart, because his offense is very, very good. And really, I guess that's the gist of it. So, having gone over that, let's go ahead and get into his actual moves and talk about what makes them useful. So, going into his normals, we're going to start with the A's. So, Wald has, well, every character in the game has a 5A, a 2A, and a jump A. Wald also has a command normal attached to 1A. 5A and 2A are both 8 frame startup, as mentioned before. These buttons have very, very large hitboxes for A normals, as you could probably expect. 5A in particular is very good for covering the space in front of him, especially the assault airspace. So it's not really a proper anti-air, but it is a pretty good button to throw out just to control the space in front of you. It also actually has a lot of hit stun and block stun for an A normal. To show that off, just because I have Hilda here without like a proper reversal, I'm going to have the AI do a reversal veil off. On block, not on hit, because that doesn't tell you anything. And you can see that, well, actually, yeah. So, depending on the distance where you hit with the 5A, the 5A into A clap actually has no gap in between. Or it has a very, very small gap. And considering that 214A has like a pretty long startup, that's kind of surprising. So 5A is very good for pressure, it's very good for controlling the assault space. It's probably not a button you're actually going to hit in a lot of neutral situations too much, because you want to be like way out here preferably, but it does definitely have its uses. 2A doesn't really cover that same space as well because it doesn't have the high hitbox that 5A does. However, it does have a lot of horizontal range for an A normal. Like, I can hit all the way out here, which is pretty gross for an A normal. You can chain into stuff and get combos from that pretty easily. So this is really your good normal for checking ground approaches, because even though it's slow for an A normal, it's still reasonably fast for a normal that hits out as far as it does. So this is really good for controlling grounded space, and also really good for a lot of your combo confirms off of a light normal. Jump A. I wouldn't say this normal is particularly special, but it does have its uses. It's mostly just there for combo fodder because it also has a really good horizontal hitbox attached to it. But also, in a lot of situations, you can use it against crouching opponents to set up a whiff assault normal into a command throw. There are a lot of different moves you can do this strategy with, but Jump A is pretty popular with some people. So it is useful for that. Also, you can actually do kind of a safe jump setup with it, which I recently discovered. So if you've ever seen Gordo do stuff like rising jump A, falling jump A, Wald can actually do that too. He doesn't have as many cheeky setups with it as Gordo does that are easy, but it is something that I found pretty recently that I'll show up a little bit later. So it is good for that. Last but definitely not least is 1A. This button is extremely good. It's 9 frame startup, so it's 1 frame slower than the rest of his A normals. But this button is +2 on block. It is cancelable on hit or block and has a very long cancel window attached to it. And it also recovers just really, really fast, so it's not likely you're going to get punished for whiffing it anytime soon. On hit, it also calls that fall over stun state, which is actually long enough that you can link into 2A afterwards. So just hitting with 1A randomly can convert into a full combo. This is pretty solidly one of Wald's best normals by a significant margin. It's not going to lead to quite as much damage as a lot of others might, but the utility of this move cannot be overstated. And we'll probably go into that a little bit more later as well. But yeah, the main features of 1A are the fact that it's +2 on block, the fact that it's special cancelable for a pretty long window, and the fact that you can link into 2A off of it on hit. Fun fact, if you get a counter hit 1A and you're keen enough, you can hit confirm it and actually link into 2B and counter hit, which is going to get you a bit more damage on the combo. So that's pretty nice. Moving on, B normals. So 5B, 2B, jump B, and then Wald has a command normal attached to 4B. Wald's B normals are pretty much the most important normals that he has in his arsenal. They're ones you're going to be using a lot in just about every situation, so it's very important to get familiar with how they all work. Also, of course, there's dash B, and that one is also very important, so we're just going to jump right into these. So 5B is Wald's main footsie normal. It can actually hit pretty much everybody at round start. It's 13 frame startup, which is still pretty slow for a B normal, but it has massive range. It doesn't have much of a hurt box attached to it, really. and it pops people up into a juggle state that lets you easily cancel into a clap and continue a combo from there. This really is your main space control tool, especially out at these ranges. Hit confirming into it is pretty important, or really just canceling in the clap and then confirming off of that. There's really not much fancy to say here. This button is just really, really good, and it's a really important part of playing footsies with this character. Normally what a lot of people expect to see out of Wald is just assaulting in and doing jump C, trying to get as close as possible, as soon as possible, but you really don't need to do that with this character because stuff like 5B is so strong that you can still establish threat from way out here and not have to worry about assaulting. So learning how to play neutral around this button is very important because that's going to be the core of your grounded strategy. 2B. This is Wald's only low attack in his entire arsenal. It's 11 frame startup, so it's still kind of on the slow side, but it's pretty good range for a low attack. It's -5 on block, which means that at most ranges where you would want to use it, it's still going to be safe if you don't cancel into anything. And there are merits to not necessarily canceling into anything with this character. So it's pretty safe to just throw this move out as long as people aren't trying to blandly assault at you. It is very easy in neutral to dash up 2B and catch people that are overly hesitant. Clip somebody in the toes, hit 5B, pick them up, do stuff. 2B is definitely the other button that you want to play neutral around in most cases. It's a very, very good button. This is only low, so of course it's going to be pretty important. So yeah, really not much fancy to talk about here. Just know that really you want to pay attention to how you're using these two buttons in neutral to establish control. Jump B. This button isn't really particularly special for a jump-in normal, it's mostly just combo fodder. One thing that's nice about it, though, is that it is quite a bit faster than Jump C. I believe Jump B is 10 frame startup, Jump C is quite a bit slower than that. So, even though this button is mostly for combo fodder, Assault Jump B can actually be a really good poke for approaching people, because usually when people are trying to scope out Wald assault attempts and anti-air him, they're usually basing their anti-air timing around something like Jump C. Jump B is usually fast enough that it's going to clip their vulnerable frames before their anti-air button will kick in with head invuln, and you can usually trip people up this way. This isn't something I personally do a whole lot, but it is worth noting that at times you can actually kind of confirm this into a 360B on landing. It's kind of hard to do if you do the jump B really early, but it does technically combo. So if you're really trying to like get some kind of damage off of just like poking with jump B, you can do that. Just a thing on the side that I thought that I'd point out because it's kind of neat. Last, but again, not least, 4B. This button is also extremely good for many, many reasons. It's arguable whether or not this button is actually better than 1A in terms of overall utility, but yeah. So 4B is pretty slow as far as buttons go, however it has a lot of very interesting properties attached to it. In particular, 4B is one of Wald's many normal attacks that has projectile destruction properties. So, Wald's unique trait as a character in this game is something that's very handy for grapplers in general. Wald has a number of moves that will delete projectiles if the move makes contact with them. So maybe I can demonstrate this since I have Hilda here. We'll make Hilda do B Skewer since that might be easy to work around. And then we'll try to demonstrate this. So, normally, that skewer would just hit me if I was standing here. However, because it made contact with my 4B, the actual projectile portion of the move just got deleted. You can see the difference for when I do it too late. So, 4B, being one of Wald's moves for destroying projectiles, is notably good because the amount of active frames on the projectile destruction is extremely large. This is because there's a number of frames before the actual startup of the move that can destroy projectiles, and also the shockwave effect that's produced when he slams the ground can do the same thing. So this move can be really good to throw out against, like, especially Batista, if they're just really greedy with throwing out things like lasers or orbs and things like that, because this button just deletes all of that. So it's really good for controlling people that are trying to zone you, but also it's +2 on block on its own, and if the shockwave effect hits, which is the delayed effect that happens if 4B doesn't make contact with them, the shockwave is actually +4 on block. So really this move is just like so good for neutral, for checking zoning, for establishing pressure, stuff like that. And then of course on a hit, it causes that fun animation walk, which is cancelable after Wald headbutts them. And even if it doesn't do a clean hit, the shockwave can still hit them and trip them up. You can't really get anything off of the shockwave hit, unfortunately. I've tried and tried and tried to get something fancy off of this, but you really just can't. It's just a convenient side effect if they don't block it. But the clean hit on 4B is a staple of many of Wald's combos. And the mechanics of that we'll get into when I actually discuss combo routes with the character. But just know that this move has a ton of utility. For the most part, when you're learning the character, you'll probably just use 4B in combos mostly, but over time you'll see just how useful it is in general utility situations and gain more and more appreciation for it. It's a very good move. It's very good to get familiar with it as soon as you can. So next we'll do the C normals. These are fun. 5C, 2C, 6C, 3C, Jump C, and Jump 2C. So there's a lot of C buttons to work with, and they're all also very interesting. So let's get into those. 5C. As you can see, this button technically does not have as much range as 5B does horizontally. However, that is a lot of space that is being covered. And it's 15 frame startup, which is... it's definitely not fast, but considering how much space is being covered, it's pretty quick for just how dominating it is in screen space. It also has pretty low whiff recovery for a C normal, especially with that much space coverage. So this normal is just really, really good for, like, I'm not going to say a zoning tool, but if I say that it's a zoning tool, you'll probably understand what I mean, just because it's purely a really good space control tool. You can cancel this into stuff, obviously, but because of the way that it knocks people back, using this in neutral is not often going to lead to a whole lot of opportunities for you unless you're really close. you know, you can swipe, but hit confirming that is a little tricky and it's not going to give you a whole lot. One thing that is handy, and one thing that I do use, however, is that if you actually make contact with 5C, you can buffer a jump cancel and then combo into jump 214A after it connects. You can kind of hit confirm it. It's pretty handy. And because of how jump cancels work in this game, if you buffer the jump cancel and it gets blocked, well, you don't jump anyway, and this move's only -5 on block. Despite the fact that it has tons of range and tons of pushback, which basically means this move is entirely safe to throw out pretty much whenever, as long as you're not going to get interrupted. And if you buffer the jump cancel, you still also have a pretty long special cancel window to be able to cancel into a clap or whatever you want in case you think people are going to hit buttons. So this move really just has a ton of neutral applications. It really is meant to be a tool for dominating neutral space and not necessarily for doing combos or anything fancy like that. Unless you're in the corner. If you're in the corner, this move is like absolutely abusive. It's pretty easy to pick up a straight hit into like almost whatever you want depending on where you're sitting range-wise. Again, it's only -5 on block, so you're not going to get punished for doing it. This is another move that you have to put time in with the character to really get familiar with just how powerful it can potentially be, because there are a lot of ways to use this normal and really just establish control with it that is hard to emphasize just messing around with the character. But it's definitely something to pay attention to because there's a lot of value that can come out of that. Um, 2C. 2C is definitely on the faster side. As far as C normals go, it's 11 frame startup, I believe. This is one of a couple of normals that Wald has that actually has head invuln, so this is meant to be an anti-air move. It also pops people up quite a bit, so it launches on hit, which lets you do quite a few things for combos. If you hit someone grounded, you can do a really delayed A-clap cancel or B-clap or whatever, and kind of just go into a standard B&B from there. Another thing that's pretty common to do is if you're trying to anti-air somebody, a common sequence that people will do is 2C into 1A. This is pretty similar to like Hyde or a lot of other characters doing something like 3C into 2A rebeat on an anti-air. Because if it counter hits, you know, they're not going to be able to tech until they get close to touching the ground. So if you actually get 2C 1A here, and you're not slow like I am, you can get a pretty clean confirm off of an anti-air like that into basically whatever you want. So that's really like the main usage for 2C outside of like combo fodder mostly in the corner. It also has a pretty long cancel window for staggering pressure and stuff like that, so it's very useful. Primarily as an anti-air though. That's really the standout use for that button. 6C. This button doesn't really see a whole lot of use in neutral, but it has interesting properties that are worth talking about. So it has 2 hits. It has a hit on the early portion that if it connects, it throws the opponent against the wall. It uses one of your bounds, but it's pretty easy to convert off of into stuff. More so in the corner than mid-screen, but you can still do cool stuff with it mid-screen. If the first portion doesn't hit, then it turns into that. That second hit there is an overhead. It's one of the 2 overheads that Wald has that are grounded. And it's +5 on block. On paper, that's pretty good. And it's also special cancelable, which is pretty handy for actually converting off of that second hit. In practice, there's a pretty big gap between those 2 hits, which means it's pretty easy to just get hit by people that are trying to mash out if they see it. Never mind the fact that the overhead portion is honestly pretty slow, all things considered. So it's one of those things that you'll probably catch somebody off guard with it if they've never seen it before or they have very little experience against the character, but it's not something you want to rely on in pressure because it's pretty easy to get mashed out trying to do it. If they let you do it, you're still +5, which is great. So it's not that it's a bad move or anything. It's just not something that's going to get you probably as much mileage as you might think it would. So that's really the bulk of what I have to say about 6C. Again, pretty good on paper, but your mileage will definitely vary in practice. 3C. This button is very good. This is, in my opinion, Wald's primary anti-air move. This is actually an aerial throw, kind of like Gord's B assimilation. So you can't block it, and if you try to shield it, you're going to get grid broken, which is fun. It has pretty quick startup. It has pretty early head invuln. I don't know the exact frames on it, but it's Wald's other designated anti-air normal. It's a staple of corner combos because it does a lot of damage single hit. And mid-screen, if you do it raw, you can actually convert using 66B. So there are a lot of ways to use this. It's really good defensively against opponents that think that you're going to do something like a reversal 360 to get out of pressure, or people that are just worried about ground-based grabs in general. And if you're really paying attention to how people play, you'd be surprised how common that is. So 3C is a really good call-out move because it can lead to a lot of damage when done raw. And furthermore, this is kind of funny, it's actually whiff cancelable in the supers. So one of the favorite Wald gimmicks that's attached to this is this. Where you do 3C whiff canceled into 360C. Shacho, the Japanese Waldstein legend, has definitely made quite a bit of use of that in his time. It's something that will pretty much always catch people at least once. It's a pretty powerful gimmick. So yeah, there's a lot of utility that can be gotten out of 3C. And it's really a great tool for rounding out Wald's kit as a grappler because it covers for cases where your typical ground-based 360s and throws and stuff like that won't cover. So it really helps establish Wald as being the kind of character that punishes people really heavily for making the correct read on their movement and their approaches. So now for all of the jump Cs. This is Wald's jump C. You're going to see this move 10,000 times, and you're going to use it 100,000 more. This button is probably the best jumping attack in the entire game. And it's probably pretty self-explanatory as to why. It is gigantic. You can jump and immediately do it, and it will literally always hit, regardless of whether they're standing or crouching. Has a pretty healthy amount of hit stun. You can not really cross up because the game has cross up protection, but still do things that look like cross ups hitting it. It's great for approaches on assault. You know, really anything you could want out of a jump in, this is it. Most notably, however, this button can be charged. So if you hold down the button, it's going to inflict more hit stun, a lot more hit stun. It's going to do more damage. It also has a fairly unique property if you hit someone out of the air with it. So you see, if I hit someone with jump C in the air, pretty standard effect. However, if I hit them with charge jump C while they're in the air, it straight up OTGs them. So it's pretty easy to pick up stray hits with charge jump C and convert into full combos, regardless of how your opponent is moving. It has a ton of block stun. Even if you do it pretty much at the soonest possible moment after jumping, you're actually going to be at advantage after you land, unless they shield. We can probably get into that a bit more later, because that's more like in-depth mechanics. Point is, this is a really, really good button. It's great for calling out approaches, it's great for approaching people, and calling out certain defensive attempts. It's surprisingly evasive, because it's just this really huge airborne move. There are so many applications for this move. Just in neutral, on offense, really whenever. It's probably the single greatest call-out move that Wald has in his arsenal. And it converts very easily into whatever you want on hit. It's very easy to go on a power trip with this move because of how powerful it is. There are ways around it, though, which you will learn over time, but, you know, this move is really never going to go out of style with this character. It's very, very strong. If your opponent has demonstrated that they don't know how to deal with it, you can almost certainly ride this button to victory at some point in time. So that's another move you really want to get familiar with as you're playing this character. Jump 2C, the body slash. I love this move. It's really goofy. It also has really fast startup. But it's not really the most useful in terms of capitalizing into damage. It's almost entirely a utility move. So one of the notable things about Jump 2C is that it carries your air momentum to a degree, which allows you to cover way more distance off of things like assaults if you're trying to approach. So if you're way out here and you need to get in, you can very easily make that happen by assaulting and then doing Jump 2C. However, it's not safe on block. It has a very, very small cancel window if you're trying to make it safe, and it's only cancelable into supers. So you can't really hit confirm stuff with it. You're not going to be able to get a whole lot of damage off of it unless you do like a really hard call out. Like that. But it is very handy if you have chain shift. In fact, it's probably one of the best things that you can do to approach somebody if you have chain shift, because this move is also notoriously difficult to anti-air due to how it shifts Wald's hurt box. It also has a pretty big hitbox attached to it. So unless you're deliberately looking for that move at the time that it's coming out, it's very unlikely you're actually going to be able to anti-air it. So it's very, very good, again, as a move for utility. And as you explore that utility more and more, you're going to see, you know, just how handy it can be, especially in matchups like this against like Hilda or Batista or other characters that are really good at keeping you out. Move that I forgot to mention earlier. Thank you, Frankentank, for reminding me of this. Jump 6C. This move is mostly, and I stress mostly, a combo fodder move. However, it has a lot of really great properties attached to it. It has really fast startup for a C attack. It wall bounces on hit, and it actually has a lot of block stun. To the point where if the opponent is blocking, even if they shield this, you're still going to have a pretty significant amount of advantage. Like you can see, I did an assault, and it got shielded. And shielding normally causes you to have a lot of extra landing recovery. But if I do my 360A, they're still in block stun and still able to actually tech the 360A. So even with the bonus landing recovery, the reduced block stun on the opponent's part, and all of these things that dictate that it should be their turn, I can still mash out my 360, and they're still in block stun. The only reason that this is hard to use correctly for those purposes is because the hitbox on it is not very good vertically. It really is meant to be more of like a horizontal move. In that light, if you do it early, it's another good option for whipping and assaulting you with 360. So that is worth noting. But if you delay it, you can kind of hit with the part of the hitbox that's attached to Wald's body. And actually, you know, get your pressure from there. So if you can learn how to implement that hitbox in a way that you can get those plus frames, especially if you know that they're going to shield, it's very, very useful for that, and it's really one of the prime features of the move outside of combo fodder. But it is a little tricky to use. Still, it's very handy. Backtracking a little bit, I should get into Wald's 2 dashing attacks because I bypassed those. This is Dash B, and this is Dash C. Dash B is probably one of the more infamous moves in Wald's arsenal. It's definitely one of the ones that people had to learn how to deal with very quickly back in the UNIL days. This really is one of Wald's best advancing attacks, and it's not hard to see why. You can see how much space it covers. It has 10 frames startup on activation, not including the dash frames, which means it's very fast. It covers a lot of space. It's cancelable. So Dash B clap is a very common pressure string, whatever, that you see out of Wald in general. It's not hard to see why, because it works at round start, it works from still pretty far away. It's pretty easy to convert from. It's really just like, you know, it's a great move. The only caveat with 66B is that it's actually got a very low amount of block stun, despite having a lot of hit stun. On its own, on block, it's minus double digits, which means it's surprisingly easy to mash out of on block. To demonstrate this, This is not necessarily a realistic situation, but I do 6-6B into A clap. And I don't cancel into A clap on the first frame, I can very easily get mashed on with a 2A in the gap between those two moves. If I do 6B into B clap, I'm definitely going to get mashed on. This is a thing that not a lot of players actually exploit, however. So really, this is one of the primary knowledge checks that Wald has in his pressure, because 6-6 into clap is still a very good series. It's not necessarily all that easy to exploit, but it's a very good way to check to see how people respond to it, because it definitely has weaknesses. There's definitely a very large gap in between 6-6B and clap, no matter what version of clap you do. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's not foolproof, but it's a very good litmus test, because it can still convert into good damage, because UNIST gave him the ability to cancel 6-6B and a charge B clap, which actually gives you a full combo, which he didn't have in UniL. But we'll get into that a little bit later, because that's special move stuff. 6-6C, finally. This move is basically just a weird forward-moving version of Wald's jump 6C. It does, however, have an initial hit as he's about to extend his hand forward. So it can hit twice. The actual startup of the first hit is pretty fast, but you really don't want to hit with only the first hit of the move, because it's really not safe, as you can see. However, if you hit with the second hit of it, it still pretty much has the plus frames of jump 6C. So dash C can situationally be a pretty good move, but it's pretty easy to avoid the second hit if you just crouch. This move is most notably good for covering the airspace from further away. This is probably most noticeably pointed out against characters like maybe Byakuya or Seth, who actually have things that they can throw out that put them airborne at about this distance. And this is a really good way to check that airspace in case they want to play the game that way. People used to swear by this move back in the day. It still has its uses, but honestly it's kind of situational these days. It can be pretty funny because the second hit doesn't always reliably hit grounded people, to do this as another tactic for whipping into a command throw. It's also kind of useful as an approach tactic for certain types of knockdowns. So like for example, if I actually hit someone with a regular throw, I'll buffer into 6-6C to get that quick approach. That is not a reliable tactic off of a lot of Wald's knockdowns, despite what you may be inclined to believe, but it is a potential usage for the move to help you close distance in certain Oki situations. I think that pretty much covers it for Wald's normals. So now we're going to get into Wald's force function, which I don't think I really covered last time. So we're finally getting to that. So Wald's force function makes him throw a rock. This is supposed to round out his kit in such a way to where Wald actually has a concrete way to deal with things at long range. Force function has 2 hits. The first one happens as he's picking up the rock. The second one is the actual rock throw itself. The frame data for Wald's force function is very deceptive because it makes it sound like it's, you know, really unsafe on block. However, that frame data is very dependent on the spacing at which you actually use the force function, and it also doesn't really take into account the fact that the rock active frames on the second portion happen very early, which means it's very easy to hit on a super late active frame of the rock and actually have way more frame advantage than you would expect. That's something that I'll get into a little later with like pressure tactics. But what you mainly need to know is that the regular version of force function is just a standard hit. But really, force function becomes way more useful when you have Vorpal. Because when you have Vorpal, it's way faster and it wall bounces. Which lets you do like way more cool stuff. Such as full combos. Full combos, for that matter, that can be initiated from basically any range. Even full screen. As long as you're paying attention. You can actually manipulate the trajectory of the rock throw a little bit. So like for example, that's the standard range of force function. It doesn't quite go full screen. If you hold back, you can actually throw it a little bit closer, change the trajectory a little bit in case people are trying to close in on you. But if they're full screen away, you can actually hold forward and just chuck it the entire way across the screen and hit people that are sitting at that full screen distance. This can be done regardless of whether you have Vorpal version of force function or not. But it is important to note, if only because a regular rock thrower will not hit people at full screen. You have to hold forward to make that happen. This can also be important to note if you're trying to use force function pressure in the corner, but that's weird tech we'll get into later. Because that's kind of non-standard. Okay. So I think that does it for basically the Wald's normal moves. So let's get into more of the fun stuff. Wald's specials. Obviously you want to learn how to use all of his stuff, like, you know, in distinct ways that are actually valuable. But it's really important to get familiar with how useful all of his special moves can be, because it's very easy to railroad yourself into just using like clap and 360 and not really using any of his other moves, and not really getting a full picture of the game plan. So we're going to make sure that we solidify just how important all of his moves are, because they are all pretty much important for different purposes. First, we'll get into the simple inputs, so 236. So 236A, 236B, 236. So the 236 series is definitely a little more underutilized. Well, maybe not as much lately, but in the past it was, because it didn't have some of the glaring obvious advantages that other moves had, but these moves are still very important. 236A, I believe, has something like 17 frame startup, which is pretty fast when you consider that Wald is taking a big step forward and able to hit from 3/4 of the screen away. It knocks back very far. It does pretty chunky damage for a single hit, and it is super cancelable, obviously. It's not really safe on block at all, but it does cover a metric ton of space. If you're familiar with Wald and BB Tag at all, you're probably aware of how good that move is when backed by an assist. Well, you don't have assists in this game, but this move is really good for catching people that are falling asleep at distances where they think that they're safe. Because ideally, you want to make people scared of playing around this button. 2B, 5B, stuff like that. And if they're hovering under range that those buttons aren't necessarily threatening, well, still gotta watch out for this. Especially if they have chain shift. If you have chain shift, you can very easily just hit confirm into something like that and get a ton of damage. Even if it gets blocked, you still have a pretty good way of getting in, because you can initiate this from really far away. And at that point, it is almost like you're just doing it back with an assist. So you can immediately start pressure off of this. From really far away, which is obviously useful considering that most other approaches with Wald are pretty predictable. So the A version of 236 is important because it is much faster, and therefore it's really easy to catch people off guard with this at distances where you would not normally be a threat. You can think of it as like a high-risk poking tool of sorts that can convert into pretty good damage if you're paying attention, but that's really what it's used for. 236B, I really love this move. It's a great move. What makes 236B different is that it's slower. I believe it's 26 frame startup. But, unlike 236A, it's an overhead. This is the other grounded overhead that Wald has. And because it moves him so much further forward, it's way easier to convert into more stable and potentially bigger hits. Especially because this is actually a decent tool to use up close from mix-up. So you can get a pretty good chunk of damage just hitting with this. And again, because it's actually a proper mix-up move as an overhead, you can punish people pretty heavily for not blocking correctly, especially if you have this back with chain shift. Even if you don't have chain shift, it has a pretty long window for canceling into supers, which you can use for either gimmicks or safety. In particular, and this works for 236A as well. If it gets blocked and you don't have CS, you can do a delayed cancel into a 360C. This will actually exploit the fact that block stun expires just before you activate the super, and will actually grab them unless they jump out. You have to delay it pretty significantly, but it still works. If you do 236A, you can do it way earlier. It's way easier to time the gimmick that way. Of course, you can do the 720 version, but we'll get into that later. If you don't want to go for a gimmick like that, and you want to remain safe, you can do 214C. We'll also get into that later, because we're kind of skipping ahead. But that's just to point out how long the super cancel window can be on those moves. 236C is technically around the same startup as 236A. However, instead of just being kind of a standard knockaway hit, there's actually wall bounces, which means that you can get full combos on them. Another thing to note about 236C is it actually has, I think, the highest minimum damage scaling of all of Wald's regular supers, which means that if you're doing like an optimal combo or you're trying to kill somebody off of a hit, 236C is actually the super that you want to end with in most cases, because it's going to be the most likely to give you that extra bit of minimum damage to secure the kill. So as you can see right there, at least 600 minimum damage without Vorpal. It's actually quite a bit more than a lot of the other stuff that Wald has. It's kind of odd that that's actually like his highest minimum damage super, but that's something that I learned fairly recently, and it's kind of important to point out. So you definitely want to use that if you're trying to close matches out. Okay, so that's pretty much it for that. Next, we will get into the collapse. This is the fun stuff. 214. This is A, B, charged B, and C. If you're familiar with Hugo in Street Fighter at all, you probably know exactly how this move works. It is not particularly fast on startup, however, it has very low recovery, a pretty big active hitbox attached to it, and it also destroys projectiles. This applies to all versions of the move, but each version is subtly different in its own way. The key thing to note about all of Wald's collapse is that all of them, on block, have some amount of frame advantage attached to them. There's also multiple active frames attached to each clap that expand outward from the initial hitbox. So if you actually hit with one of the later active frames, this advantage goes up, but by default, the A version is +1. The B version is +4. The charged B version, I believe, is +7. And even the C version, I don't believe it's actually plus on block, but I believe it's like -2 at worst. It is definitely safe. So these moves are really great ways to apply safe or even advantageous pressure off of anything that is special cancelable. They have different utility in combos. They're really important for pressure, they're really important for combos, just all around super valuable. You're going to be using them a lot, like a lot. And the sensitivities between them for the most part are that, you know, the A version is quite a bit faster than the others. The charged B version, most notably, is the longest startup, but it guaranteed pops the opponent up into the air for a combo. Regardless of whether or not they're in the air or they're grounded. Which means that if you're doing dash B clap, you can pressure with some of the others, but the charged version will actually give you a full combo off of dash B. The charge version of clap is new in UNIST. It did not exist in UniL, so if the last time you even looked at this game was like 3 to 4 years ago, you might not recognize it. But that particular version of the move is a godsend, because it means that Wald can actually use a standard pressure tool to convert into good damage. The C version, most notably, is actually very fast. The A and B versions clock in at like pretty high double-digit frames. The C version is actually a net 7-frame startup, which means it's actually faster than Wald's normals. And it's also safe on block. It's a pretty staple super for combos as well. It's definitely the super you want to use most if you're trying to transition into like infinite worths or stuff like that for like CBO combos. So it has a lot of utility. It's a pretty valuable super. And it also lets you reversal punish things that you might not be able to reversal punish normally. Those are kind of some situational cases, but they do exist. So really just the speed and the safety of that super is what makes it valuable. Because it lets you do stuff like, you know, if you don't have CS, you can jump to C into it immediately. You get okay damage if it hits. If it's blocked, well, you're safe and you're in. If you do swipe into 214C, well, you just swiped in from like 3/4 screen away, and now you're basically in. And if you have CS, you can CS the super, and then get a full combo off of that. So there's a lot of utility that can be had here, just with all of the nice properties that are attached to it. That's gonna do it for that at the moment. Let's get into the DP series, 623. Some people dub this Fury Swipes, which kind of makes sense. These moves are really fun, but for the most part, the C version is the one that you're going to see the most. Still, 623A, 623B, and 623C. The differences between the A and the B versions are very subtle. The A version is technically slower on startup, and has a different knockback property. So you can see that the A version doesn't really knock them up very high. The B version, however, knocks them up way higher. They do the same damage. They're roughly the same on block. Not technically safe, but if done at the proper range, they're still pretty hard to punish. But the thing that's notable about 623A and 623B is I think they're actually on startup as fast, or technically even slightly faster than Wald's normals, especially considering the range that they cover. So this is a surprisingly good Abare move for checking people's approaches or covering a lot of space where they might want to hit buttons and stuff like that. If you hit with one of these, you can cancel into a super to convert. On this front, what's worth noting is that if you're going to do something like a 623 and then hit confirm into like 236C, which is probably your best follow-up, doing the A version of swipes is going to give you a much more stable confirm than if you do the B version, as you can see, just because of how high they get knocked up. So probably doing A over B is generally a good idea, although I think B is technically a little bit faster. But if you're trying to go for some kind of stable conversion, that's the way to go. These moves, I believe, also technically have head involvement attached to them. They are designated anti-air moves, but they're kind of hard to use in that front compared to just 2C and 3C. They are pretty good at covering the assault space, though, so if you're confident that they're going to either do a weird approach or attempt to assault in, this is a pretty good way to check that space and get a decent conversion. These moves are also actually kind of nice when you have CS backing them, but we'll get into usage with those later. Also, notably, these have pretty long super cancel windows, which means that the gimmicks that we talked about in relation to 236A and B, they also apply here. So, doing late cancels into 360C, stuff like that. In this case, I think using the B version is a little better because there's not as much block stun at the end, which means that if you want to go for this gimmick, you probably want to use the B version. And you have to delay it quite a bit. It's kind of funny, like, how long you can actually delay it to enable that gimmick to work. So that's where, like, notable uses come into play for swipes. 623C. This is one of Wald's 2 reversal supers. 623C is pretty comparable to Merkaba 236C, in the sense that it is invulnerable for its entire startup, even though the startup is very long. And it also lets you do follow-ups afterwards. However, with Merkaba, 236C lets you get a pretty much like a full combo follow-up pretty easily because of the wall bounce. In Wald's case, it's a little different. So if you hit somebody grounded, you can link into swipes. And then if you really want to spend an extra bar, you can convert off of that. Like so. And that works when people are grounded. What really makes this shine is if you actually manage to hit somebody while they're airborne with 623C, you can just get a meterless conversion. Using 623C. And it's pretty easy to visually hit confirm whether or not they're airborne or grounded when you hit them. So as far as an anti-air super goes, it's pretty nice because if you actually hit them when they're airborne, you get way more reward without having to spend extra resources. Of course, if you're really greedy and you hit them while they're grounded, you can CS and get like way more time to convert off of it. But you don't need to, which is nice. The problem with 623C as a reversal is that it's 17 frame startup and the invulnerability time does not cover the first active frame of the move, which means it will very frequently trade with things that are active, and it's also incredibly easy to safe jump because it's a 17 frame reversal. It is still very useful because people often get scared of reversal 360C and will react to a super flash and probably not recognize the startup animation, and then we'll just end up jumping into this and getting hit. So it's not useless, but it has very clear weaknesses attached to it as a reversal super. So you really want to pay attention to when the right time to use it is. So that does it for that. Now let's get into the grabs. This is the fun stuff, the 360s. So the 360 is pretty much Wald's signature move as a grappler. And all of his 360s have pretty distinct uses. So the A version is done up close. It doesn't have a whole lot of range. In fact, I think it actually has like technically like less range, or maybe slightly the same amount of range as a regular throw. It's about the same. But what's nice is that this is a 3-frame startup move, which makes it one of the fastest attacking moves in the game, if not the fastest. It looks very cool. It does a decent amount of damage. Unfortunately, it kind of knocks them pretty far away on hit. Like, almost full screen. So, as satisfying as landing this is, it can actually kind of mess up your pressure quite a bit if you do it at a bad time. But, again, it's 3-frame startup. It's really easy to open people up with. And if you're really good in execution, you can do things like a dash up 360, which lets you implement it from way further away than you would be able to normally. Learning how to do a dash 360 is a very important part of getting really good with this character, because you need to be able to establish that threat. It's also almost entirely impossible to react to. And considering the amount of threat that Wald can establish on block, if you can exercise that threat more easily, then obviously you're going to get a lot more mileage out of it. 360B works a little differently. As you can see, 360B works from like way out here. The difference, as you can probably see, is that 360B is actually techable, like a normal throw would be. This doesn't mean that it's bad, but it does mean that the usage of 360B is a bit more methodical than would be for like a 360A. Whereas 360A is 3-frame startup, 360B is 6, which means that Wald actually has a long-range attack that causes an animation lock that is faster than all of his normals. There are a lot of implications that go into that, and having that discussion is probably out of the scope of this video. But just know that there's a lot that you can get out of a 6-frame move that causes an animation lock. Even if they're able to tech out of it and thus avoid taking damage, you can still escape a lot of situations by implementing this correctly. Furthermore, if you can get the opponent in a situation where they're hitting buttons, scoring a counter hit with 360B means it's not techable at all. So there are ways to implement this where if you can condition the opponent to mash in particular places, you can probably throw a 360B in certain parts of your pressure and still get it for free, basically. And of course, if your opponent's trying to shield defensively, well, this is going to break the hell out of that. And in fact, this is probably one of the most common implementations of using command throws for breaking shields that Wald has, is the quintessential mix-up between dash B clap and dash B 360B. Because people are often going to try to use shields to create bigger gaps in your clap pressure, but if they shield at a bad time and they green shield in the middle and you do this instead, you break their shield for a very, very long time, because command throws inflict grid break state for, I believe, the largest amount of time of any other potential move in the game. And this is really what Wald's command throws are meant to be used for, is establishing that grid break threat pretty easily. Last but not least, 360C. It has the range of 360B, but it is not techable like 360B is. It is overall, I think, 8-frame startup, so it's slower than 360B, but it is also a true reversal. It's actually invulnerable the entire way up to active frames. So really, it's Wald's most reliable reversal. It's an extremely good tool for getting out of pressure situations. Anything you could imagine a long-range grab super with invulnerable frames could be useful for, it's probably useful for. Obviously, a lot of experienced players are going to be looking out for this move, so doing it on Wake Up is not something that I would advise getting into the habit of doing, because that's something that, you know, it's pretty like beginner to intermediate level tactic in fighting games anyway. Really what makes this useful is when you are dealing with pressure strings that have gaps in them, and using this to blow through the gaps. Because those are situations where people might not be as prone to looking for 360C as they would normally be, and it's also going to be much harder for them to actually escape the super, even if they're looking for it. So learning the gaps in your opponent's pressure and using 360C to get out is a very, very good tactic, and it's really one of the things that makes Wald not completely terrible on defense, because not many characters have that kind of tool at their disposal. So it's definitely something that you want to make use of. Now, the bonus thing to note here, which is a UNIST exclusive thing that was not in UniL, you can actually input all of Wald's 360s with 720 motions. If you do, you get a nice big double circle pop-up underneath your combo meter, and you actually do get something other than that, but that's the coolest part of it. So when you get the successful 720, the command throw does 100 points of extra damage, and instead of putting the opponent basically full screen away, puts them about like half screen away. And it also lets you recover a bit faster, so you can actually re-establish your pressure afterwards. So ideally, whenever you land a command throw or set up a command throw, you really want to try to make it the 720 version if you can, because you're going to get way better positioning, you're going to get more damage. There's really no incentive to not do it if you can buffer it. Thankfully, this is not too hard to do off of typical tactics that involve whiffing an assault move into a command throw. As I've mentioned before, you can do this with Jump A, you can do it with Jump C. You can also do it with Jump Charge C, which is my personal favorite, because the wind-up is still the same as Jump C, and you could potentially hit with Jump C on the way down. But if you actually do a Jump Charge C straight out of an assault, the Jump C will not come out before you land, and you can go straight into your grab every single time. It's very consistent, and it's a nice visual trick. Because theoretically, you could let the charge go a little bit early right before you land and tag somebody if you think they're going to try to avoid the throw. So it's not really an option select, but it is a mix-up you can establish off of a single button on that approach, which is very handy. Which is why it's my personal favorite for doing this whiff in the command throw tactic. You can also do the 720 for the C version. But the properties are still the same. It still only gives you 100 bonus damage. It still only gives you the same level of positioning. But yeah, ideally you want to do a 720 version with every command throw, but it's understandable that you might not crank it out every single time with the C version, because more often than not you're concerned with just getting the move out there to get the invulnerable frames to help you get out of a bad situation. Alright, that's it for that. Next we're going to do the 4-6 series, aka the God Press. This move is mostly just useful as combo fodder. It is basically just a moving command throw, so it doesn't hit airborne opponents unless they're already in a juggle state. However, on hit, it always carries them to the corner. The B version is a little bit slower on startup, but is otherwise the same move. The C version is pretty much the same. Does more damage, hits an extra time. The main thing that's notable about the C version is that after frame 6, it is completely invulnerable to projectiles until the active frames expire. Theoretically, this is the thing that Wald wants to use to blow through projectile zoning and whatnot, but in practice it's really hard to actually implement that well, because the startup is not very fast, the travel time isn't extremely fast, and most projectiles you could actually get through doing this still allow those characters to use air options or to react accordingly. So, on paper, it's really nice for getting around zoning, but in practice, it's not really like that. The other problem, quote-unquote, with this move is that, while it does guarantee to bring your opponent to the corner on hit, it still allows them to air tech, which means that they could potentially tech forward to get out of the corner. You can accommodate for this by simply walking back and maintaining the same side. However, if they don't end up forward teching, you probably lost a lot of your offensive position. So, while it can technically be a non-issue, it's a lot of extra work that you have to do to try to wrestle for corner positioning, because otherwise if you try to move forward, you might be able to cross them under, and if they're not expecting it, then they might get hit on the other side. But in general, they're just trying to get out of the corner anyway, and they're probably going to err in favor of blocking that way. So, you have to keep that in mind whenever you're ending combos this way, that while you do get the corner carry itself is not guaranteed, unless you do something extra like, for example, CS into 3C. Which you can do, but I would not recommend it, because if you're comboing into God Press, you're not really getting a whole lot of damage, you're really just not getting a lot of payoff off the CS. And when you're using CS, you really want to maximize the payoff that you get from it. Last but not least, in terms of special moves, we have the Jump 214 series. These are walled air grabs. In general, these are combo fodder. They all have slightly different properties. The A version will carry Wald's air momentum with him as he's doing it, which makes it more reliable for certain combos, like this for example. The B version has pretty much the same startup, but it halts all of your air momentum entirely whenever you do it. So this probably has some gimmicky uses as a way to fake air momentum, especially for like tricking people's anti-air attempts. It's not something that I would use frequently for that purpose, but it is technically a use for the fact that it halts air momentum completely. It's something worth pointing out in case you're more creative than I am and find a way to implement that in a way that's meaningful. The C version is basically just an aerial version of 214C on the ground. It's actually really fast on the startup. I think it's like overall 5 frame startup. However, the minimum scaling on the super is really bad. So I honestly would not recommend using this super intentionally at all, because it's not good for damage. It doesn't really have any other special properties. It's really like the one move I'd say that's like, you know, there are other moves that have situationally good uses. The only thing this is good for is the fact that it's fast, but honestly, air throws aren't going to be used much for that purpose anyway. So I'd probably stay away from it unless you're trying to do something cheeky or you want to flex on somebody. One thing I will say that's probably useful about it is the fact that because the entire animation plays out so quickly, you might be able to use it in situations where, like, you activate a CVO and you're trying to do a CVO combo into like an Infinite Worth or an IWEX, and you really don't want to waste the amount of time that comes with doing other supers. That one is particularly quick in its entire sequence, so you might actually be able to crank out your Infinite Worth or your IWEX in a situation that you might not be able to do it normally. But that's about it. Infinite Worth and IWEX, not really anything special that I need to showcase here. The only thing that's worth pointing out is that Infinite Worth is basically just a glorified version of 360C. It's 10 frame startup overall. It basically behaves the same way otherwise. You can easily combo into it off of an air throw. And usually this is how you get your optimal damage combos for 200 meter. That's probably like the most consistent, nice way to combo into your Infinite Worth. But other than that, not really anything super special to point out about it. Okay, so I know that there are a couple of things that I missed along the way, but I don't want to nitpick on those things too much at the moment. If I think of them while I'm finishing up, then I'll get to them. But for now, I just kind of want to stay focused on what I got for the moment. So combo routes. To me, Wald has probably some of the more stable means for putting together combo routes among most characters in the game. Wald is nice in terms of a character to learn in Under Night because less really is more with this character in terms of damage and optimization. So you don't actually need to do a whole lot of fancy stuff to get optimal damage with this character. And that's something that I hope that I can emphasize when I'm going over some of my personal favorite combo routes with the character. So first of all, we're going to do the standard combo here. So that's 5A, 5B into B clap. Then you're going to do jump BC, 6C after that. Then after the wall bounce, you're going to hit 4B and then cancel the headbutt into 4-6A. This is pretty much your like standard universal combo off of a basic starter that gives you a corner carry. It's very stable, it's very nice, it's like a standard starter combo for this character that's still like close to ideal. It's a very good combo to learn. So the key pieces of this combo are doing a B normal into B clap. Set up your juggle. Plotting out an air series that you want to use for the transition, and then figuring out what you want to do for your ender. So like, for example, I can kind of mix and match my original series, and as long as I get a B normal into B clap, I can still get the rest. However, you really need to pay attention to your bound count with Wald, because Wald really likes to use his bounds. For those of you who might not be familiar, for whatever reason, Under Night's combo system only allows you to do up to 3 bounds before it automatically kicks the opponent out of the combo. Bounds in this case are anything that causes an OTG state, anything that causes a wall bounce, or certain other special moves that will pin people to the ground. So for example, jump 6C causes the wall bounce, so that's 1. Jump charge C, OTGs, so that's 1. More uniquely in terms of animations, Wald's 4B actually also causes 1, even though it doesn't look like it does. So counting the number of times that wall bounces or OTG states happen is really important, because it's going to influence how a lot of your routes will eventually look as you're doing combos. And the more that you can adapt to that on the fly, the easier it's going to be to optimize your damage, because there can be situations where things might not be as stable as you want them to be all the time. And adapting to that is pretty important. So like for example, if I were to do like 2B into B clap, you can see at like the tail end there that Hilda's touching the ground. That means I've used one of my bounces already. So if I do this typical series, 4B is going to end my combo before I get to do anything. So in that situation, I might want to stabilize it a little more by just going into something like this. Well, not that, but... something like that, which would be a pretty typical air ender series for optimal damage. That's just kind of an example of the sort of adaptations you want to make. So to expand upon that, "4B" into God Press is a typical ender for setting up corner carry. So if you really want to get somebody to the corner, you'll want to do that for an ender. If you want optimal damage, on the other hand, you want to do this. Well, if I can do it correctly. So that series is 4B, immediately cancel into charge B clap, and then do 5C, jump cancel, jump C A, into 2 and 4A. That's pretty much optimal damage for a mid-screen series when you can do 4B into charge B clap. If for whatever reason you do a weak starter going into that transition, instead of doing 5C, you can just do 5A jump A into jump 2 and 4A. If you want to get cheeky with getting a proper Oki setup and are willing to sacrifice a bit of damage, what you can do is instead do jump A, jump 2C. Even if they back tech after this, you still remain pretty close to them and can actually establish some good pressure even when you're mid-screen. This is pretty notable to point out because Wald actually has like some issues with keeping on people mid-screen. He doesn't really have the greatest of OP options. And as you can see, like, regardless of how I'm changing the tech properties, I still can't really get away. So even off of a backward tech, I'm basically in her face. So jump 2C, even though it's going to sacrifice quite a bit of damage, is going to give you way, way better Oki mid-screen. And that's actually a pretty important thing for Wald, because it's something he's otherwise lacking. Alternatively, if you just do immediate jump A, jump 2C without the 5A, you can actually end up on the other side. This is a really convenient way to get a side switch universally off of most of your combo confirms. So if you want a side switch, if you want to put somebody in the corner, you just want to get out of it, very good to note that. If you do an assault starter, assault starters are naturally going to prorate the hits on your combo a bit more. So instead of doing BC 6C for your jump series, because sometimes it's not very stable, you can do AB 6C. AB 6C is the universal stable air series for getting your wall bounce. And that's going to work in basically any situation, even if you have, like, the weakest starter known to man. So, like, if I do, like, this really weak series here, you can see that BC6C won't work. But, if I do AB6C, it works perfectly fine. Jump A also has a lot more horizontal range than Jump B, which means that in situations where I'm hitting from like way out here, you see that Jump B won't hit from like that range, but Jump A will. And so I can do Jump AC 6C instead of Jump BC 6C, and it remains stable. So BC 6C, AC 6C, and AB 6C are the three primary air series that you want to pay attention to when stabilizing your air transitions. There's also this really fancy one, which is jump back 6C into an assault, into falling jump C B. That series is covered in the mission mode for Wald in the game, so if you want to experiment with that route, go right ahead. It does have its uses. It's technically pretty optimal on damage, but it is really weird to do. So if you want to experiment with it, go right ahead, and I'm showing you that it exists, but it's not one that I personally like because it's pretty easy to drop in a clutch situation, or at least it can be. So use at your own discretion. I've covered the mid-screen DNBs. In the corner, things get a little different. Easier for the most part. So instead of doing an air series in the corner, if I want optimal damage, you can just go right into 3C. Then off of 3C, you can OTG. And then what you can do from there kind of depends on the strength of your starter. But off of a strong starter like 5B, for example, you can do 2A, 2C into a slightly delayed 4B into the same series for optimal damage, except now you can do Jump CB instead of Jump CA. For a weaker starter, you can do the classic Uni-L corner combo, which always works. 2A, 6C, and then you can 4B if you want to do a standing reset, because you've used your 3 bounds at that point. Or you can just go straight into Jump CB, air grab. Ending in an air throw or 3C is ideal for your corner combos because it gives you the best potential Oki. And those are notable things with corner combos. For a couple of optimal damage routes to show off, if you get like a clean DP punish, or something that's like really easy to respond to, you can actually do this as your starter. It's a little tricky, but it's worth learning. So the starter for that was just 5B, 214A, and then linking into 66B, 214B. And then doing your jump A, C, 6C air series into whatever you want for an ender. This is pretty much optimal damage mid-screen. Keep in mind, this does not work off of 2B into A-clap, because 2B is a weaker starter. However, if you're really close, you can actually do this. Where you can link the A-clap into a 2A, and then get the same thing. It's not nearly as much damage, and it requires you to be basically point blank when you're hitting 2B. But it is possible. This is more likely to happen in the corner. One thing that's nice about these combos is that for the most part, these combos are actually pretty universal across the cast, which is why I'm highlighting the routes that I'm doing. Really, the only things that are kind of weird are more specific combos, especially with 3C. So moving on, I just want to show the optimal corner route real quick, and then I'll go into a couple of the weird things. So in the corner, optimally, you're still going to do 3C, but if your starter's strong enough, you can link directly into 2C afterwards, and then go into the same series. Despite the fact that you're technically doing fewer things in the combo, because you're basically using all C equivalent normals for the most part, you're getting way more damage. So like if I were to end that with 236C, like we talked about earlier, you see that with Vorpal I get almost 4600, which is like massive. And that's really the bulk of like the fancier routes you need to do in the corner. Obviously there's a lot of like very specific things that you can end up doing. But if you have questions about that, I'm in the Discord, like the main UNIST Discord in the Wald channel. Obviously there's going to be like a lot of weird routes that can come up here and there, but I felt like it was important to show off like the base important stuff. In terms of weirder conversions, one of my personal favorites is this one. This goes back to the whole option select of sorts where 5C is jump cancelable on hit but not on block. If you do happen to snatch something off of 5C, you can jump forward and do immediately jump 214A, and then jump 236C. Well, not jump 236C, but just 236C, super cancel. And then do something like this. So that's one route that I find to be particularly handy. For another interesting route, which is something that I didn't think to cover before, one cool property of Wald's air throw is that if you actually do it raw, not in a combo, it can actually be a combo starter. Again, this has to be the first hit in a potential combo, but landing it raw does actually give you a proper follow-up with dash move. It's a little tricky to time, but it's not necessarily hard. It just takes a bit of practice. But if you're going to call somebody out with an air throw, just know that you can get damage off of it. Do not leave that damage on the table. Now for the weird stuff, in terms of not necessarily character specific. As I mentioned before, if you hit somebody with 3C, you can do 6-6B into B clap, and then convert from there. However, the degree to which you can do this is weird, because there are actually cases where character hurt boxes will not allow you to do more extended follow-ups. For example, being able to do 6-6B after 3C does not work against Linne. Being able to do 6-6B into B clap does not work against Chaos or Eltnum, because the hurt boxes around their legs are really weird. So against those characters, you have to do something like 6-6B into 2-3-6A. Like that. Hilda seems to be weird because normally 6-6B into B clap and then doing jump A into 2-4A is a series that normally works on regular characters, but Hilda seems to be weird on that front. So that's like the easiest mirrorless combo that you can get off of a 3C. But 3C is really like the only move that has like weird character-specific situations where you might not be able to get the same thing every time. So you definitely want to experiment with that a bit to make sure that you know what you can and can't do. Because there aren't really that many other situations where things will drop at weird times, unless you're at that sensitive range. Let's see. In terms of notable weird routes, can't really think of anything, except the optimal corner route that I talked about before is actually possible off of 236 BCS, except instead of doing something like 5B into B clap, you actually just do 236 BCS straight into 2-4A, and then link into 3C. This gives you 4,300 damage for no bar off of an overhead in the corner, which is just a brief highlight of why 236B CS is so good. Next, I'm going to cover some essential usages of CS for Wald, and I'm going to try to do this kind of quick because I'm already like spending a lot of time on this. Really, one of the most useful things you can do CS-wise with Wald is just the simple 2DD option select. If you don't know what that is, Undernight has Absolute Guard built into its engine. What Absolute Guard is, for those of you who might not be keen on more generic fighting game terminology, is whenever you start blocking something, if you are still in block stun when another move is about to make contact with you, under the rules of Absolute Guard, no matter what you do from that point, you will remain in block stun as long as you're correctly blocking low versus overhead in terms of standing or crouching. You can be mashing in the middle of a block string, and as long as it's a true block string for the entire duration, you won't get punished for mashing. You'll just stay in block stun. That's what Absolute Guard is. Samurai Showdown, for example, that just came out, does not have Absolute Guard, which is why if you're blocking a multi-hitting move and you try to mash, or you stop blocking in the middle of it, you get bodied. That doesn't happen in this game. You can exploit that mechanic defensively when you have Vorpal by holding a neutral position, like 2, which is just neutral down, to stay in a low block state, and essentially mashing DD for the chain shift input. What this lets you do is it lets you relatively safely activate chain shift as soon as a gap appears in a block string. Wald is very good at making use of this because depending on what the opponent is doing when the CS activates, you might be able to 360A in the middle of the gap because it's so fast. If the move is going to become active, you might be able to 360C and break out. Or if they're going airborne, or attempting to assault or doing something weird like that, you can 3C immediately out of CS. So Wald has a lot of ways to escape situations that characters might not be able to typically escape by just mashing normally, while also potentially getting a pretty good amount of reward out of it. Of course, doing CS into 623C is also an option, and potentially the most damaging, but you have to be aware of the gap that is being created or that is being exploited by the CS. So even though 2DD is a universal concept that applies to every single character and is useful for every single character, Wald actually has a lot of ways to capitalize off of it that are worth noting. And considering that defense is one of the positions you don't want to be in as much with Wald, it's very good to know how to make use of it. So other general uses of CS. We've covered Jump 2C CS already. This is really good for getting in from long distances. And if it hits, you still get a full combo. Pretty reliable. It's most stable if you do 2B immediately afterwards. But even if it gets blocked, you're still in. Keep in mind, the CS on block will not come out until you touch the ground. So make sure that you don't try to stop mashing CS early and then end up on the ground in front of them, canceling into nothing, because then you're going to get punished. 236A CS is used for a similar purpose, for getting in. It's going to lead to a lot more damage, and if you confirm the hit, then you can go into a 236C, capitalize. This will work for pretty much any range of 236A, pretty much, and give you a nice reliable follow-up that leads to big damage. So this is really good for checking people at far away, and even if it gets blocked, you can still kind of get in with it. So that's pretty nice. 236B, CS. I've already stated how useful this is. You know, it's a very strong overhead you can cancel into off of any of your normals. You have all the time in the world to hit confirm it because of CS, and if they get hit, you just transition into the fattest combo you can think of at the time. If it gets blocked, you still have pressure. The usefulness of this cannot be overstated, especially because it's whiff cancelable in the CS, which means it's actually very good to use as an Oki option, because if people are trying to use reversals to get out, 236B CS is actually a very common way to bait reversal veil-offs, other reversals that people might try to do to get out of pressure. is just insanely good. And if they don't do a reversal and then they get hit by the overhead, they eat a metric ton of damage, so even better. Another particularly good use of CS, this is kind of a creative use, is actually doing swipes into CS. But you don't do this. We don't care about that. What we care about is this. You can actually cancel the second hit of swipes as opposed to the third. This is very nice because it's surprisingly effective at confirming green shields if people are trying to mash out. Which if you confirm the green shield, then you just grab them and grid break them and make them feel bad about themselves. If it just gets blocked normally, well, it still has a metric ton of hit stun. Block stun, rather. So, like, if I do immediate dash 360, you see they're still in block stun because they can tech the 360A. So you can very easily get more pressure going from this, because it has a surprisingly large amount of block stun for being a relatively weak hit. If it hits, it turns out that this is actually a very strong starter on hit. So really, you can get a big confirm off of this for a lot of damage. In fact, it's such a strong starter that you can actually do the fully optimal series in the corner on hit, which leads into almost 4K meterless. So, despite not seeing a whole lot of usage, 63A or 63B into CS is actually potentially very, very good for pressure, because you can get a lot of reward off of it, and it's probably one of the best ways to maintain block stun and transition into good pressure off of CS. Let's see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's like notably useful CS-wise. Apart from just other universal usage for CS, those are really the things that stand out for how Wald can implement CS in his game. Unless you're in a situation where you need to CS to do another super or something to kill somebody, I would not make it a habit to use CS in other ways commonly. Because Vorpal's a very important resource for Wald, if only because sometimes it's just important to not let the other guy have it because of the amount of advantage they can gain. But when you do have Vorpal, you really want to make sure that you're maximizing the opportunity off of it. So using it to get a little bit of extra damage here and there, or to use it off of some other opportunity is like probably not worth it. It really depends on the position of the cycle, but that's really advanced stuff that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. Now that I think of it, one thing that CS can be useful for is, well, you can actually get a full combo off of a 360. This is nice, but it scales pretty heavily. So you can see, like, I only really gained like about 800 damage or something like that off of a 360. Which is why it is useful if you can kill with it, obviously, or if you really want to get extra positioning from the combo. But in terms of raw damage, it's not a really good return on investment. Now, There is one thing that I do like if you have CS and meter available, is that 360B, and only the B version of Wald's command throw, can actually be CVO'd. So you can get that nice clean confirm into 4.2K off of a 6-frame command throw. This was a nice little feature that they gave Wald in UNIST. And it only works off of the B version of 360. I wish I could land this more in tournament, because honestly, that's a really good return on investment right there. Opening with a 360B and then converting into that much damage. Even if you don't have full meter, you can still do this and get like pretty close to 4K. Well, 3.6. Still, that's pretty good return on investment. Let's see. Other gimmicks. I think I've covered most of the gimmicks up to this point. I covered 3C into 360. I covered swipes into a delayed 360. Those are really the key ones that stand out. So I guess for lack of extra material, I'm gonna hover over Wald's matchups really quick. And then probably bring it to a conclusion from there. So you're right. Now that I think about it, how could I forget about this? Thank you for reminding me. So there are a couple of key gimmicks that need to be pointed out here, which are actually staples of some of my strategy. So let's go over those real quick. We're just going to do these in the corner because both of them are easily set up in the corner and very relevant. So remember earlier I talked about bound count and how when you hit the third one your combo ends. Well, 4B uses one of these, which is very convenient because it's still special cancelable even when you use the bound. So if I do something like an A-clap here, normally that combo would, you know, you'd still be able to combo into an A-clap off of that if I did this normally and had enough bounces. But because I use multiple bounces here, it whiffs entirely. Well, if they're not paying attention, or even if they're just intimidated by the existence of the hitbox, you can definitely use that to your advantage, as you can see. So one of my favorite tactics with Wald is deliberately ending a combo with 4B when I know my bounce count is at 3, to do something like that. Like, you know, whiffing into A-clap. And then exploiting the visual trick to buffer a 360. To grab them while they're still trying to block. Even though the A-clap will never make contact with them. You can do this with B-clap. And if anything, it's a little trickier. Because B-clap technically recovers faster, and will still generally win. the mix-up to this is if I do charge B clap, it'll still hit them meaty as they're recovering. So if they try to jump or hit buttons, not 100% reliable because timing can matter in this case. Then they just get popped up for a really big combo. And routes off of this can be interesting, but as you can tell, it leads to a ton of damage. So there are 3 different versions of clap that all look identical and can all lead to potential different mix-ups off of that. Alternatively, I could just use the restand to safely go for some other mix-up, if I've established that they're going to respect it. Such as canceling into 236B and exploiting the reset to hit them with a very early overhead. It's very hard for them to get out of or contest. And if I have CS, I can go straight into my really fat combo and probably put someone within a command throw of death by 2-touching them, which is very nice. So there are a lot of mix-ups that you can enforce off of the 4B restand, but those are like the key ones, I would say. The ones that are most notable to point out. And with that having said, I must now get into the crown jewel of walled gimmicks. As you can see, Wald arbitrarily decided that he just wanted to be on the other side. And most people, when they see this for the first time, are like, what the hell? What was that? And here's the explanation. So, as you can tell, this combo series doesn't seem to be very optimal, but it happens to knock them very high into the air while also pushing the wall forward into the corner. Basically, the way that this works is if the opponent is high enough in the air while Wald is pushed all the way into the corner, that when 4B hits, his hurt box does not shift, weird stuff happens. So like, if I hit someone with 4B here normally, you can see that like, when I'm canceling into 4B, my hurt box is shifting because of natural pushback. However, if I hit somebody into the air high enough, there is no pushback that happens. And 4B by itself, when it hits, doesn't actually cause any pushback for Wald. So if I do a particular series that pushes Wald all the way into the corner, and then find a way to hit somebody with 4B, like with a CS as well, so that I don't shift my hurt box out of the corner at all when 4B makes contact, the game gets confused, for lack of a better term, and the positioning of the hurt boxes makes it so that Wald actually ends up in the corner after the opponent finishes recovering from 4B. Which enables a really confusing and really hilarious side switch, which you can then capitalize off of because no one's going to be able to respond to that correctly the first time that they see it. I don't know exactly when this side switch was discovered, but it's been implemented more fairly recently. For all I know, this probably could have worked in UniL if you set it up correctly, but it's way easier to set up in this game. The combo that I'm doing in particular is a very easy, universal way to set it up. The point is, you need to hit with 3C, and then do 623B into 623C, and then be able to do 5C into 4B. Because it keeps them high up enough that 4B will still be able to hit without causing a hurt box shift, while still actually comboing off of 623C. However, this will honestly work with just about any combo in which 623B, 623C will hit, and you can CS. Because the important thing is that you need to be pushed all the way into the corner and then hit with 4B without shifting backwards at all. Now, naturally, just because they're switching sides, it doesn't mean they can't block it. If they know about it, then they'll just block the side switch, right? Well, the funny thing about that is that I can do a late special cancel to keep the same side. So there's actually a real mix-up off of something that appears to be a gimmick. And if I can actually set up the side switch without using my CS, like with this particular combo series, then you better be able to react to that. So even if you get to the layer with somebody that they know about the side switch, you can create a legit mix-up off of that knowledge and still get something of a legit 50-50. So that's the basic explanation of probably one of my favorite things this character has. It's really silly. It really just puts a nice little garnish onto the joy that is playing this character. Now we're going to get to the not so fun part of the discussion. So, again, I'm going to try to do this relatively quick because I've been going for a while already and I really don't want to bleed into time too much. The reality of playing Wald is that although Wald is very fun and has a lot of great things about him in a vacuum, and really does have like a lot of tools that a lot of characters don't have for getting out of certain situations, in terms of the metagame of Under Night, he's difficult to work with because realistically this character doesn't have a matchup that's really in his favor in any way. He has matchups that aren't difficult to play, matchups that are difficult to play, and matchups that are almost constantly uphill unless you can enforce your game plan. It's kind of the reality of playing Wald. That's not to say it's not possible, but you do have to acquire a lot of matchup knowledge to really push the character's strengths. So I'm going to briefly go over my opinions of his matchups with some light explanations, just going down the character roster. For Phonon, despite the fact that Phonon is generally considered to be a very, very strong character, I feel like Wald actually doesn't have a particularly hard time against her, because the thing about Phonon is that she's not a mix-up heavy character. She's mostly designed to just be able to bully you from a range that most characters in the game can't adequately contest, while also being able to deal a lot of damage. However, Wald also kind of does the same thing, but Wald is generally better at hitting harder and controlling a lot of space pretty safely. So, typical rebeat pressure that Phonon players would use to bully you doesn't apply as much to Wald as it does to other characters, because Wald can actually contest a lot of Phonon rebeats with 2B and 5B. And because the hurt box on his assault is so weird, it's actually pretty easy for him to get around a lot of things Phonon would do in neutral, apart from like 4B. So as long as you're not getting tagged by 4B or force function, Wald actually does really well against Phonon in neutral, and can really bully her when he gets in. So I honestly feel like the matchup is like a solid 5-5. It's really not a bad matchup for Wald to play, despite what a lot of early opinions thought about it. It's actually one that I kind of enjoy playing, and I feel very comfortable in. So I really don't think that Wald needs an excuse to be afraid of Phonon. Nanase technically classifies as one of the characters that's a little easier to fight, largely because Nanase's neutral game is kind of dependent on setting up reliable projectiles to start getting in, and Wald naturally just eats projectiles by swinging. So Nanase is kind of forced to play like an honest neutral game against Wald. She does have really good buttons to do that with, though, and once she gets in, it's just really annoying. I don't think things are really tilted in either character's favor. I think it's pretty even. But it is nice that Wald has things that allow Nanase to stay a little bit more honest in neutral. So it's really just a matchup where you have to be familiar with fighting Nanase, and that's about it. Because otherwise Wald doesn't struggle too much. Seth is Seth. I could go on forever about like just how annoying Seth is to fight, but to be honest, all things considered, Wald has way more tools to deal with Seth in neutral and on defense than most characters have. 3C is a very good tool for stuffing a lot of gimmicky or wild airplay that Seth would normally like to implement. And the fact that Wald's damage output is naturally high means you can usually 2-touch Seth and put him within range of death very easily. So the damage differential and the health differential mean that Wald actually does have a bit of an advantage. And in neutral, he can actually be very successful against Seth. It's just, once you have to block Seth, you're gonna have a bad time. So just by virtue of how Seth can run his game plan, it's tempting to say that it's slightly Seth-favored, but honestly, I think it's very close to even. And this is one of the things about Wald that's nice, is that he actually does reasonably well against strong characters. He doesn't have bad matchups against any character in the game that's like really, really strong, except for like maybe Yuzu. But he does pretty well against Seth. Hyde is, I mean, people are pretty annoyed with fighting Hyde, but I don't think there's really anything about this matchup that's like, you know, glaringly bad. 6B is frustrating to deal with. Exploding orbiters are actually kind of annoying to deal with because Wald can't stuff them, which is odd. And 3C is a really good button for checking assault approaches. But if you're paying attention, Wald generally has a lot of ways to cause problems for Hyde in neutral, and beyond that, fighting Hyde is pretty much standard fare. So I feel like it's not a fun matchup to play all the time, but I think it's pretty even. I don't think Wald actually struggles that deeply against Hyde. Linne also fits into the category of relatively easy matchups for Wald to play. If anything, I'd say it's actually probably his best matchup, quote-unquote, because Kuga is kind of a central tool of Linne being able to do things, and Wald really doesn't care about Kuga because, again, he kind of just invalidates it by swinging. But when played at like the highest levels, Linne can still actually hurt quite a bit. She's very good at pressuring Wald because her frame data is pretty good on that front. Her force function can actually dodge his command throws, which is something I learned fairly recently, which means that force function is actually a pain to deal with. And really, the utility of Linne's force function against Wald is what gives her enough of an edge that it's not directly Wald favored, it's relatively even. But I think for the most part, fighting against Linne is not a huge chore. If anything, the vast majority of Linne players are going to struggle against Wald inherently. It's really only at like the highest levels and the greatest level of understanding of Linne and her options that you're probably going to have difficulties, and even then, you can usually come out on top. Carmine is annoying, but I would say that this matchup is also not super difficult to fight. It's like Nanase, where if you know how to fight Carmine, you're probably going to be okay, because Wald can actually do a lot of things to break out of Carmine pressure that a lot of other characters can't, because 360B is actually really good at getting out of certain plus frame situations, just because Carmine's buttons are surprisingly slow, and having a long-range 6-frame command throw is really good for stuffing a lot of those. Carmine has a few buttons that make approaching him difficult, but usually Carmine's just throwing health away to throw out those moves that keep you from approaching so easily, so it balances out. I'd say it's pretty even. Yuzu's not fun. I personally don't think that this matchup is as much of a disaster as most people make it out to be, but it's definitely Yuzu favored. You really just have to play the patience game for a long time. Try to find opportunities to get Vorpal to swat her out of bad Bato usage, and keep the pressure on, because once you get the pressure on her, she doesn't have a whole lot of tools for really getting out. So it's just a lot of patience, I'd say. She still can mess you up pretty badly, but it's not insurmountable as long as you're willing to wait for your opportunity. Byakuya, I'd say, is like one of the last matchups that Wald has that is not hard, surprisingly, because, again, by virtue of just swinging, Wald stuffs a lot of Byakuya web stuff in neutral. Byakuya just kind of naturally struggles a little bit in neutral as a character, outside of like 5A, but Wald is really good in neutral. So that polarization and their capability in neutral is where Wald has the advantage, but obviously getting hit by Byakuya sucks, and having to block Byakuya sucks, because usually when you get hit, you lose control of Vorpal for the rest of the match, which sucks for Wald. But Wald does have a few creative tools he can use to get out of some of Byakuya's stuff. So really, it's just a matter of if you understand how the Byakuya player wants to follow up on their set play, you can make callouts that let you get out and go back to neutral where you can win the game. So I think it's relatively close to being Wald favored, but I'm still going to say it's even. I hate Mika. I think the last time that I did this video talking about Wald matchups, I didn't really stress that much about Mika. My opinion on that has changed a lot since then. Fighting this character is a giant pain in the ass. Between Tornado and Missile, it's very easy for Mika to just kind of do stuff that can catch you out of trying to move, converting into non-trivial damage off of those opportunities, and then starting pressure that seemingly never ends. You really have to be willing to take a risk that will let you start your pressure early and get rid of her as soon as possible, because otherwise it's very easy for things to go badly for you once you get started. It's really just hard as hell to get out against a really good Mika player. I don't know exactly where this matchup lies, number-wise, but I'm going to say it's at least 5.5 in favor of Mika. It's just not fun. Eltnum, this is another character that people don't usually like fighting. Personally, she doesn't bother me that much, but that's probably just because I'm so used to fighting her. The key things to note about fighting Eltnum is that ricochet bullets are easy to check with 236A if they're just spamming it. Beyond that, you mostly just have to watch out for 2C and neutral, and you have to be really patient when she gets in. There's nothing insurmountable about dealing with Eltnum's pressure. The only thing that's annoying about Eltnum, really, is just the amount of damage that she gets for guessing right. But Wald has enough health to be able to take some of those hits better than other characters, so I think it's slightly Eltnum favored, but I don't think it's that bad. I think it's really just having good defense will go a long way. I think we all know how I feel about Hilda by now. I hate this character. Recently I literally just wrote an entire long document about how to fight this matchup, so if you want to know, go read that. All I have to say about it beyond that is this is pretty much universally considered to be Wald's worst matchup. It's at least 6-4 in Hilda's favor. You have to be able to get in and get started early, because there's a lot of ways that this matchup can go south very fast. It's typical grappler versus zoner annoyance. Read the document that I made if you want to learn more about it. It's very hard. It's probably one of the hardest matchups to overcome in like a tournament 2 out of 3 setting. It's doable, but it's... ugh. Merkava is like... I feel like my opinion on the Merkava matchup changes on almost a weekly basis. On paper, I think it's pretty even. The problem is that Merkava has so many very good tools that can be used in so many different ways that you have to identify the tendencies of the Merkava player to be successful. Because if you fail to identify what they're making use of, it's very easy to just straight up lose to Merkava in a tournament set. But there are a lot of things that are common across Merkava players that Wald actually has an easy time dealing with compared to other characters. So I think on paper, it's a pretty even match. It's something that the more that you play it, the more comfortable it gets. And it's really easy to steamroll Merkava players that aren't taking advantage of like more advanced tactics against Wald. So it can still be stressful at times, but I think it's very manageable on average. Aurier's also not particularly fun, but I think the only thing about Aurier that's frustrating is just the fact that she can run away from you so easily. Checking backdashes with Wald is like very hard. It requires pretty good reaction, and if you mess up on the reaction, you get punished for a lot. And then dealing with Orie Oki is not really fun either. But it's kind of like Eltnum in the sense that if your defense is good, you'll probably survive. If you're aware of what she can do with Force Function and you properly call it out with 3C, great. You're already on the way to doing way better in the matchup. The key thing really is just to be patient getting in, because she has a ton of ways to shut down approaches and punish you for non-trivial damage. I mean, obviously nobody likes Wagner, like, nobody. But realistically, like, it's definitely in Wagner's favor, but I don't think it's super terrible. Again, Wald actually does have a little bit of an advantage in neutral. So if you can use that early advantage to try to keep her from getting buffs early, you definitely have a much better chance of potentially snowballing into a victory. But once you have to block, it's like, you know, it's just not fun. We can meme about Wagner's mix-up potential or lack of mix-up potential all day. Wagner doesn't have particularly difficult true mix-ups, scare quotes, to deal with, but it's very hard to find a good window to mash out of her pressure, and the cost for messing up on that is usually very high, and Wald's health differential doesn't really help, because her damage output is still just massive regardless. So you just have to be able to make a lot of really good defensive calls, react to the mix-ups that do come, and like you gotta pray that you're picking out their habits correctly. Because otherwise you could just end up blocking for the rest of the match and there's not a hell of a lot you can do about it. So despite the fact that Enkidu is generally considered to be the worst overall character in the game, Enkidu actually has a favorable matchup against Wald. Enkidu has a lot of moves that are surprisingly good in neutral for shutting down Wald's options. 4C is basically the no-fly zone button for Wald. Rekkas are surprisingly good at catching Wald's hurt box in a lot of cases. A really good Enkidu player that can capitalize off of stray hits and carry you into the corner is going to give you a really bad time. Blocking against Enkidu in the corner as Wald is absolutely the worst. 6-6B shuts down both of your reversal options if used correctly and leads into like big damage if a counter hit happens. So I don't know, like, Wald can still do reasonably well against Enkidu in neutral, but you cannot just press the advantage whenever you want, because if you try and you fail, you will probably die. More so if you can't command a Vorpal. So those are the main things with that. Again, just be aware of your screen positioning. Try not to end up in the corner, and if you do end up in the corner, don't be surprised if you have to use Veil Off to get out of a bad situation, because your other reversals are likely to get stuffed, and you're going to lose 4K, and you're going to hate yourself. So, yeah, just be careful with that. I love Gordeau as a character, but this matchup is also, like, suffering. Like, this is the other matchup that some people will say is probably about as bad as Wald versus Hilda, but for a different reason. Gord is able to pretty easily exercise like a very low risk game plan against Wald that still allows him to zone Wald out pretty well and, you know, convert into a pretty good amount of damage just implementing Mortal Slide and Force Function. If you lose grid against Gord, then you're probably just going to have a bad time for the rest of the rounds, and considering that Gord steals grid, keeping Vorpal can be challenging, to say the least. Once you get hit, the threat of assimilation is a pretty big hindrance upon your game plan, because the fact that assimilation has longer startup than any of Wald's command throws means that he's going to benefit from throw invulnerability for a longer period of time, which basically means that a sim kills your command throw game, especially defensively. If you fight a Gord that doesn't exercise assimilation in their pressure munch against Wald, you probably have a chance, because they're not taking advantage of the thing that cripples Wald the most. Because at that point, all you have to do is just block correctly. But once they start enforcing the command throw in their game plan, this matchup can easily snowball out of control, like out of nowhere. Granted, if Gord has to block, it's not much better for him, but he definitely has more ways to safely get out than you do. So, really, if anything, the fact that assimilation is such a key piece of what makes the matchup bad probably means it's not technically as bad as Hilda, because Gord is still kind of relying on something of a risky strategy to make it as annoying as it is, but there's no pressure on Gord to do anything particularly risky for most of the match to get leverage against Wald. You can play pretty lazy with Gord, and if your Gord is semi-competent, you can probably beat 95% of Wald players out there. That's just kind of how it is. Batista is also definitely very much Batista favored, but I wouldn't say it's like a hell matchup. I mean, Batista's just a really strong character, and I feel like just the strength of the character is really what makes it not great. I don't think there's anything in particular that's like very strong that Batista has that stands out against Wald. Because you can just shield most of your zoning tools or use 4B to stuff them. You can even stuff lasers with 4B, which is pretty cool. But, you know, getting in can be annoying, but it's not the end of the world. If anything, one thing that's nice about Wald is the fact that command throw is so useful. It means that Batista is more compelled to jump the gun on making a flash kick read, because you can't react to a raw command throw attempt with flash kick. You have to kind of know that it's coming. So if you can get within the range where command throw becomes a threat, it means that Batista can't just down back on you for the entire game. Which is one thing that Wald does have in his favor against her, but the rest of the matchup is still like, you know, her damage output's naturally high, so your naturally high health doesn't really matter so much. Wald doesn't really have a good way to deal with gems once they're out, without making like hard callouts or having resources. You know. But every character struggles against Batista like that, so it's really just pointing out that Wald has things he can use that other characters don't have access to that make it easier, but he's still a big target, and his high health doesn't really save him, so it's just not great. Chaos. I think there's a lot of like varying opinions on fighting Chaos in general, but I think it's a pretty even matchup for Wald. Really, the only thing that kills people against Chaos is just lack of matchup familiarity. Obviously, Chaos can force some pretty crazy plus frames with the way that he uses Aji, but Wald can pretty easily just swing properly and stuff Aji doing stuff, and then if Chaos tries to keep him out with 6-6C, well, not 6-6C, 6C, the book. If you make Chaos whiff the book, you can whiff punish him with 2-3-6A, and then if you have resources, you can convert that into a corner carry. And then once you have Chaos pinned in the corner, he kind of just dies. So I feel like I really don't feel like it's that hard to fight against Chaos. Again, the only thing that makes it hard is just not understanding how to fight Chaos. When you realize that you mostly need to make use of like proper shielding to take grid from him when he's applying too much Aji pressure, because Aji has no mix-up, and you control grid like that. Once you've established that you know how to control grid in the matchup, it's way easier to fight. And then from there, it's just, again, getting familiar with how to fight him properly. I don't particularly enjoy fighting Akatsuki. It's definitely slightly in his favor, but how bad it actually is, I think, is kind of personal assessment. The key things to note are that despite the fact that Wald on the surface has a distinct advantage in neutral against Akatsuki, because Wald has gaps in all of his clap pressure, that means that Akatsuki can get a ton of opportunities to just parry you and punish you for trying to do like normal pressure. So it forces you to do very non-standard things in your pressure game. And even in just some of the things that you do in neutral. So, because an Akatsuki that knows how to enforce parry against Wald can manipulate your game plan like that, it makes things a little bit more complicated. Never mind the fact that Wald does not have a good way to deal with Bitatsu. If anything, the depressing thing about this matchup is that Bitatsu, despite being a meme, is actually incredibly effective against Wald. Because even if Wald shields the last hit of Bitatsu, you can't actually punish it without meter. It's -7 on shield. Wald only has 8 frame normals. 360B is 6 frame startup, but Akatsuki is not considered to be in a counter hit state by that point in time after Bitatsu recovers, which means he can still tech it. And 360C is 1 frame too slow. You can actually punish Bitatsu with 214C if you shield the last hit. That is something that I've overlooked for a while, but emphasized that you have to take what you can get. And if you have CS, 214C is actually a very strong starter, which means that if you're anywhere near the corner, you can actually get like big damage for punishing Bitatsu pretty clean like that, as well as depositing him into the corner. So it's not the end of the world dealing with Bitatsu, but Bitatsu does out-prioritize a lot of what you would want to do in neutral. It shuts down like so much of your approach. Like you really are kind of forced to play around Bitatsu in neutral, as well as parry. So Akatsuki has a lot more control over the neutral game than you would expect, and then when you have to start blocking him, it's an absolute nightmare. I mean, Squish himself said it, that after messing around with other characters, he realized just how privileged Akatsuki is on frame data, and that's not a lie. This character's frame data up close is absolutely monstrous. And for a character like Wald, where everything is really slow, that's amplified. So, yeah, it's definitely Akatsuki favored. I don't hate fighting the matchup for the most part, except just aggressive use of Bitatsu. It's a very interesting match for sure. And it's definitely one that comes down to who has more knowledge of the other character's capabilities. And just to round it out, the mirror. like all good mirror matches in fighting games, this is 6-4, not in your favor. Wald is really bad at dealing with his own shit, because Wald is very heavily organized around plus frames, and when your character has a lot of things that enforce plus frames, and all of your frame data is the same, that means basically whoever gets started with their pressure first wins. And the neutral is really funny, because you're both trying to do the same thing, and both players are trying to like do weird assault patterns and whatnot, and just swinging. So 5C ends up becoming a really good button for just controlling space in the mirror to keep people from moving. 236A is also really good in YOLO to control the 5C mashing. So really the name of the game is don't let the other guy move, and then when you hit him for trying to move, put him in the corner and don't let him play the game anymore. And that's basically how the mirror goes in a nutshell.